Morning.
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 I've been attempting in these talks to show a kind of intersection of Zen and the arts, and the arts of all kinds. Early on here, it came to my attention, this book came to my attention, Where the Heart Beats. And it is by Kay Larson, who was a disciple of John Dido Laurie's. Also, I think she was a journalist at the New York Times, and a writer in her own right, and she dedicates this book to Dido Laurie and also the Dalai Lama. I almost feel more uncomfortable now than I did last weekend, oddly enough. So. My introduction to Zen, when it really came onto my radar and I became interested in it, was back in the late 80s. I was out of school for a few years, and my girlfriend at the time was still in school working on a master's thesis. And she was working on both art history and information sciences. And my background was in art history, so she had this paper to write and was quizzing me about who the Dadaists were and the Futurists and the trajectory towards modern art. She ended up writing a paper called Dada and Zen. And I'd never really considered what Zen was. Of course, it was a popular word. It was all over the place at that point. It was, there were perfumes being named and that. There were restaurants popping up with Zen in the title. But I really felt compelled to find out what it was and what it was about. And I had practiced meditation since high school, and so it had always kind of, having some kind of contemplative practice, you know, even if it was walking in the woods or something, was very important to me. So this girlfriend and I had a long conversation about it, and it really spurred my interest. I found myself in bookstores, kind of going to the Eastern Thought section and looking up everything I could. One of the first books I dug into was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shinryu Suzuki. It was a pretty important book at that point. John Cage, who is the focus of this book, subtitle here is John Cage, Zen Buddhism and the Inner Life of Artist. And ever since I was a painter here at IU, I've been interested in John Cage. And the intersection here is pretty clear and pretty broad, but it's interesting how intricate it gets. And John Cage's own immersion into art and contemplative practice. He actually met D.T. Suzuki, and well, let me take this another direction. At the very beginning of this book, first paragraph, talks about Gary Snyder leaving his home in California, traveling across the Nevada desert, hitchhiking, coming to Indiana, in fact, Indiana University, coming here to study paleontology. I thought that was an interesting connection by itself. Gary Snyder is one of my favorite poets. While he was hitchhiking across the desert, he pulled out a book of essays, I think the title was Essays on Zen Buddhism, by D.T. Suzuki. And so that was his introduction, and it actually sent him eventually to live in Japan for something like 12 years. I think his wife is also Japanese. I think he met her and she moved here. They now live in Northern California. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of connection. Feel a little bit closer to Gary Snyder these days. But also there is almost a kind of incestuous artistic relationship that seemed to happen within Gary Snyder's life, coming to know Kerouac. He is supposedly I can't remember his name, in the book On the Road. Is it Jaffe? Do you remember the name? Jaffe something. It almost looks like Gary Snyder.
Yes.
I can't remember what the name was. That is supposed to be him. I thought that was pretty wonderful and interesting. Anyway, and then there is, of course, D.T. Suzuki, and how he is sort of the beginning of the move of Zen to the United States and to the intellectual community and the arts community. He came to know a young fellow that I can't remember if I can even find his name at this point. Was teaching, I don't know what the university is, in LaSalle, Illinois, as a kind of scholar. And this young man was actually translating some of the earliest Buddhist texts that people were getting their hands on in the United States. And at one point he translated the essays of D.T. Suzuki. I'm going to read this. The influence of Suzuki's cascade of Dharma books was incalculable. Until he published Essays in Zen Buddhism, first series in London, 1927, the West had access only to a handful of obscure academic treatises on Buddhism and a few passing references to Zen. First series was a turning moment. A later edition of this book changed Gary Snyder's life on a desert highway in Nevada. Alan Watts, who was everybody's favorite chronicler of Zen at mid-century, confessed in a headnote to his book, The Spirit of Zen, 1936, that he would never have been able to write it without the 3 volumes of Suzuki's series, Essays in Zen Buddhism. Watts had discovered Essays in Zen Buddhism during his teenage years in England. The book inspired him to read everything Suzuki wrote. In 1936, Watts didn't miss the opportunity to get to London to hear Suzuki address the World Congress of Faiths at Queen's Hall. Watts bought his ticket and watched speaker after speaker loftily declaim on the theme, the supreme spiritual ideal. Finally, Suzuki took the platform in the final session. He was just a country, simple dweller. He told the mass crowd, he continued, really, I do not know what spiritual is, what ideal is, and what supreme spiritual ideal is. For the rest of the talk, he described his house and garden in Japan. The audience rose and gave him a standing ovation. And then there is an anecdote that Watts continues to put out there, kind of giving you the idea of what Dr. Suzuki was like. Watts says, I remember a lecture where a member of the audience asked him, Dr. Suzuki, when you use the word reality, are you referring to the relative reality of the physical world or the absolute reality of the transcendental world? Suzuki closed his eyes and went into what was a characteristic attitude, which some of his students called doing a Suzuki. For no one could tell whether he was in deep meditation or fast asleep. After about a minute's silence, though it seemed longer, he opened his eyes and said, yes. John Cage engaged Suzuki as a teacher at one point and listened to Dr. Suzuki describe koan practice. After hearing Suzuki discuss koans in class, John Cage wrote a series of stories in the form of short tales, autobiographical fragments as Zen koan, as he explained on the cover of the book of his book, Silence. This is from a book he wrote in 1961. Not all of them are about Zen. There is the story of a master telling a student to commit suicide. It comes directly from DT's autobiographical essay in Early Memories. Dr. Suzuki, apparently before he even learned much English or was even considering coming to the States or had been invited to come here, I can't remember how he got here, spent some time in a Zen monastery. And so he really was coming from a kind of authentic place. In Suzuki's essays, Early Memories, they were stories largely about mushroom hunting, music, and other things that happened. Oh, this is actually Cage, but referring to the Early Memories, and were about mushroom hunting, music, or other things that happened to Cage. In 1961, these tales reappeared as witty afterthoughts. These stories as Zen koans, as John Cage put it. They were akin to punctuation points at the end of chapters in Silence, his book Silence. Each koan-like story was a fragment, self-contained, gleaming like a jewel in its setting. The setting itself, the gold that holds the jewels, was the Cagean principle of indeterminacy. This principle, Cagean principle of indeterminacy, has been the thing that I've kind of grabbed onto, because it is, I've almost been trying to think of a way that it is like almost a mathematic equation for the way he does the way he thinks through his projects and his work and his trajectory of work. Indeterminacy is I guess the way I like to think of it is maybe something like impermanence, active impermanence. He absorbed this through his classes with Suzuki. Cage had encountered teachings on indeterminacy in Suzuki's class. Indeterminacy means literally not fixed, not settled, uncertain, indefinite. It means that you don't know where you are. How can it be otherwise, say the Buddhist teachings, since you have no fixed or inherent identity and are ceaselessly in process? I mean, the form of this paragraph just kind of reminds me of, this is the point where Hojo-san would be drawing the Indra's net on the whiteboard. It's so similar. Inspired by Suzuki's class, Cage had been exploring ways to write music that was indeterminate, both in original intention and outcome. He started by, well, one of his favorite things was to use the I Ching, Book of Changes. He would write music with the help of chants. In this way, Cage linked his life and his music. Life is filled with uncertainty. Chance events happen to all of us. Each of us must take responsibility and make decisions. None of us should be imposing our ego image on others. Most music tries to control its circumstances, just as most of us do. But there's another way to live. Accept indeterminacy as a principle, and you see your life in a new light, as a series of seemingly unrelated, jewel-like stories within a dazzling setting of change and transformation. Recognize that you don't know where you stand, and you will begin to watch where you put your feet. That's when a path appears. What can be analyzed in my work, John Cage says, or criticized, are the questions that I ask. There were so many people that became the fabric of the modern arts movement. There's a point here in the book, in the description, described as the modernist Sangha. Modernists would give Cage entry to a new kind of Sangha. During Cage's first 3 decades, the modernist Sangha consisted of people who had nothing in common, apart from the expectation that the human world could be investigated via new creative methods. Cubism, 12-tone music and atonality, geometric and graphic abstraction, the synesthetic fusion of art and music. These and other turn-of-the-century inventions were both the forms and the means of reimagining reality. So, including Dadaism and futurism in this, I think he was extremely attracted to the idea of Tristan Tzara's way of making a poem. The description here is: take a newspaper, take a pair of scissors, choose an article as long as you're planning to make the poem, cut out the article, then cut out each of the words that make up the article and put them in a bag. Shake it gently, then take out the scraps one after the other in the order in which they left the bag. Copy conscientiously. The poem will be like you. And here you are a writer, infinitely original and endowed with a sensibility that is charming, though beyond the understanding of the vulgar. Amazing. At the outset, Dada and Futurism would show him how an artwork, broadly speaking, could contain and construct a worldview. Composers, especially Henry Cowell and Arnold Schoenberg, opposite poles of the avant-garde, would introduce him to the excitement of contemporary music. Cage was indisputably a composer, and in later years he would make exquisite music. But at this stage of his life, artists supplied something he couldn't get anywhere else. They showed him how to ask the most provocative question. At this young age, Cage was in his 20s, and seeing how he was collecting these philosophies and views, he eventually met, because he was part of the circle of the modernists, Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp at this point wasn't at all famous, wasn't really well known. But I think Cage was kind of blown away with his way of ready-mades, which I think had to have extremely profound way on the way that he made music eventually. Can one make works which are not works of art? This is about Duchamp. The young French painter brought with him a silly little idea, so private and insignificant that not even he could have anticipated its immense consequences. After a trip to Munich in 1912, which served, he said, as the scene of my complete liberation, he came back to Paris and mounted a bicycle wheel upside down on a kitchen stool. He wrote himself a note in 1913. Can one make works which are not works of art? It's the birth of the ready-mades. In the ready-mades, Duchamp asked, with the urgency and rigor of a Zen master, what is this? What is this? Makes me think of Hosshin holding up the pen and saying it is a pen, it's a thing I use, but when it runs out of ink, what is it? It's no longer a pen. It's kind of like in my business, a chisel and sharpness are the same thing. A dull chisel is not a chisel, it's a chunk of metal. At this point he was engaged in looking at the world, Duchamp was. One of his famous ready-mades was finding a snow shovel in a hardware store and then writing on it the expectation of a broken arm. It gives a different direction and point of view, to everyday objects. The shovel will be used. Is that why it is not art? So art is only and exclusively useless? At this time, there was kind of the beginnings of Buddhism, I think, in this country. First decades of the 20th century, and the Congress of Religions, and Soyen Shapu, and there was, I think it was often thought that there was Buddhist poetry, I think, that people were starting to become engaged with, the way of writing. There was a book by a fellow named Paul Carew, The Gospel of Buddha According to the Old Records. This was the, well, let me read. This was out of little lonely LaSalle, Illinois. That's where Paul Carew was. It was compiled in 1984, and out of text and stories from the Buddhist canon. The Buddhist Gospel was so successful that Soyen Shaku asked D.T. Suzuki to translate it into Japanese. Carew then brought out a German edition, which was followed in 1902 with the French version, and the curator of the Musée Guimet, Paris's Museum of Asian Art. This was recently digitized. So, this idea, so art is only exclusively useless, for me immediately connects to the good-for-nothing zazen that we do here in the temple. The profundity of everyday objects, the way that we just tend to look past them and just not consider that it's in your hand and used for something, or feel what it actually is, or to find ourselves walking on a sidewalk, noticing the cracks and the weeds, the bugs, feeling the air, everything tangible. Duchamp's ready-mades seem to kind of come into the public purview a little more profoundly. I think it was 1917 when he and a buddy were, I think, walking around New York City, and go into a hardware store, and he purchases a urinal, standard kind of cast iron, porcelain covered urinal. So it was absolutely clean, it wasn't a used one. And wrote Our Mutt on it, 1917, entered it in a kind of gallery competition. And it created such a stir amongst the critics. People hated it, loved it, thought how ridiculous it was.
Question.
Yes?
Didn't he also give it a title?
He did.
The Fountain, wasn't it?
The Fountain, but actually the original title was The Blind Man Was the Buddha in the Bathroom.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, I didn't know it either. It's pretty interesting. I mean, I've been seeing this piece for years and years, especially if you're interested in art history. But Alfred Stieglitz actually took a photo of it, and it's one of the more famous photos. But okay, so here, pretending I'm on the back side of this, you're looking at it from this direction. It goes like this. It's laying on its back. So if you're actually peeing into this thing. It's tipped up and it's like this. So it's tipped on its back like this. So you're looking at the inside, and then there's little holes here where the drain goes. So it's shaped like this. Alfred Stieglitz's photo comes around like this. It's a perfect little Buddha picture. The thought is that Duchamp probably directed Stieglitz to actually point the camera in that exact direction to get that particular view of it. Part of me wonders, is that something that Duchamp had discovered just at that moment? You know, you think about setting up some item like this to photograph. Someone like Stieglitz, you know, looking at the different sides and then coming around and, you know, Duchamp seeing that and, oh, this is where it needs to go.
But if it was exhibited, right, then Duchamp would already have been thinking about how he wanted people to see it.
I expect so.
Isn't that right?
I expect so.
He probably had chosen that way of setting it up so that people would see it that way.
Well, you know, I'm trying to think. I don't have a picture of the thing, of course.
I'm sorry.
Where the R Mutt is written on it, 1917. And R Mutt is loosely a borrowed signature of the actual manufacturer, who was J.L. Mott Company, something like that. So I'm guessing it was just inspired that way. The shocked outrage that greeted the urinal, what was it? As the blind man essay was quick to point out, there is nothing immoral in the urinal itself. The eruptions of violated sensibility were coming from human beings whose unexamined expectations, habitual beliefs, moral rigidity, squeamishness about the body, conditioned responses, and exalted sense of propriety were causing howls of anguish. This raging cyclone of emotion is a succinct definition of dukkha, the Sanskrit word that sums up the suffering of cyclic existence brought on by our ego fixations. These, of course, are Kay Larson's words. I'm trying to think of a kind of a segue. The ready-mades, John Cage's attitude and sensibilities, looking for a different way of speaking or doing art or writing, the attraction to the Dadaist and the Futurist. I think eventually he was able to read the Futurist Manifesto. Let me read this. Russolo, a conservatory-trained musician from Milan, had turned to art and was making paintings and engravings in 1909 when F.T. Marinetti spun his wheels in the air. This is not what I want to read. Basically, within the Marinetti's Painter's Manifesto was also a technical manifesto in 1910. Marinetti was a militant futurist. Italy is where futurism and futurists kind of got their foothold. Ruzzolo, who was a painter, was a musician, but turning to painting. Ruzzolo saw a futurist view of music, one that honored ordinary sounds as the art of advanced civilization. Machines make noise, Ruzzolo noticed. The ordinary world had plenty of music in it. A whole amazing variety of noises fell outside the classical musical canon. The murmur of water, air and gas and metal pipes, the mutter of motors, breathing and pulsing like animals, the throbbing of valves, the thudding of pistons, the screeching of mechanical saws, the jolting of a tram on its rails, the cracking of whips, the flapping of curtains and flags. To this, Ruzzolo added crashing metal shop blinds, slamming doors, muttering and shuffling crowds. All of this is the eventual inspiration for Cage. His prepared piano pieces, taking metal bolts, chunks of wood, wedges, placing them on a piano, on the strings, or screwing them in there. The idea of a musical reclamation of noise. Cage said he read Ruzzolo's manifesto in 1935. It was instrumental in giving him a new idea that burst upon him like a shower of fireworks. Cage was usually a little loose with his dates, but in this case he must have been correct, since he wrote his first percussion music quartet in 1935 when he was 23. At this point, musical reclamation of noise became Cage's mission. But he also wanted to study with Arnold Schoenberg. He took classes with Schoenberg. Took Schoenberg's class on harmony. He said several times, I'm speaking as Cage, several times I tried to explain to Schoenberg that I had no feeling for harmony. He told me that without a feeling for harmony, I would always encounter an obstacle, a wall through which I wouldn't be able to pass. My reply was that in that case, I would devote my life to beating my head against the wall. And maybe that's what I've been doing ever since. He eventually revolted against Schoenberg, but it says here that he eventually learned important lessons, both musically and emotionally. When Cage studied with Schoenberg, he found himself defending noise without quite understanding why. Not until he met D.T. Suzuki would he finally realize what was so important to him in letting ordinary things speak in their own voices. Cage recollected in 1975 that Buddhism had given him the tools to understand what bothered him so much about Schoenberg's 12-tone method of composing music. Though we had gotten along beautifully for 2 years, it became more and more clear to me and to him, Schoenberg, that he took harmony fundamentally seriously, and I didn't. Cage didn't. I had not yet studied Zen Buddhism curiously enough. When I did, which was about 10 or 15 years later, I would have even more reason for not studying harmony with Schoenberg. But at that time, It was as though I was wrong and what I was interested in was noise. The reason I couldn't be interested in harmony was that harmony didn't have anything to say about noise. Nothing. I was trying to think of ways to relate this to my own work and the way I worked. I had both figurative and abstract teachers that taught from those points of view at IU. My favorite teacher was somewhere in between. His paintings would often start out rather abstract, and they would become figurative. Things would emerge from them. My own feeling came to be that paintings need to have a kind of fluid performing quality, even though they're static things. I've talked about how paintings need, or for me, can be a kind of, this is maybe a terrible way to think of it, but Rorschach for the moment. What you see in it is what they become, or where your mind is at, or where your emotional engagement with the painting is at that time. So my painting emotionally would come out of a way of abstractly, I would engage it in the night, I would paint, I would find myself responding to what I was seeing, and at the times it was the most satisfying, not necessarily the best paintings. I was letting the paintings paint themselves. I remember getting excited about being in the studio and enjoying what I was doing, and the next morning go out there and be excited about seeing them again, and usually being disturbed by them. They just weren't that interesting or that good, or I felt like they were leaning too much towards a kind of figurative work. That's the kind of engagement, the way I'm understanding Cage at this point, and the way he was beginning to make music. So at the point of the prepared piano, this is where I want to leave this lecture. I'm saving, I think, the juicier stuff for next week and my final talk. So I'm going to stop here and just open the floor for any questions or comments. Okay.
I've got a comment.
All right.
I have a comment, but I'm trying to form it, or, yeah. One, it is kind of nice to actually be able to see some of Duchamp's ready-mades in person. That was actually quite cool. I find it interesting, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. But my head against this many times in Dharma study and chanting as well. And I find it interesting, we're coming at it from emptiness here, and I was introduced to Duchamp in a philosophy of art class in phenomenology with a professor strawmanning Duchamp. How can you call a urinal in the Louvre art? And I find the whole interrelation to be interesting. But in one sense, isn't Dadaism more a response to the horrors of humanity? And not a true form of emptiness, but more of more or less a reaction towards World War I. And in that sense, not really Zen-like.
Well, I can't make that pronouncement. I don't really know. Dadaism covers quite a range of things.
It started out as, from what I remember,
it was a literary movement at first.
Yeah, it started out in poetry, and it
Yes.
started out as a reaction to World War I.
Yes.
To where it was like, if this is the best that humanity can bring us, then I'm rejecting everything. You know, the tale on the battlefield, Christmas, to where the opposing forces, rose up and just a song of a Christmas song, Silent Night, or in German and English, Across No Man's Land, or the infamous, I forgot who it was, they had a soccer match in No Man's Land.
Mm-hmm.
And the football still exists, or they're trying to reclaim some sense of humanity out of the death that machines brought. And I've always, I read that Dadaism was a response to that, to if this is what humanity's brought us, so I'm going to reject the arts as what we see as human and do this. The putting together of the poem, the art, the poems, the articles, by just cutting and pasting. Didn't Burroughs write a page, cut it in fours, repaste, and that was the page? That seems to be more of a comment. That seems to be more of a reaction and a comment against than just emptiness itself.
Well, on the other side of that, everything could be considered a reaction to something else. Something else comes along, it's a reaction. One kind of art is a reaction to another kind of art. Nothing comes out of a vacuum. Nothing really comes, I don't know, this gets philosophically difficult because we think of emptiness, but I think the attraction for what Cage is trying to do is express as much as possible, from that emptiness. And I don't know if it can ever be successful in any way. Liberating the voices of ordinary objects frees them to be unique. Two screws, or wheel hubs, or tea kettles sing differently. You have to listen in a new way. So that kind of speaks to what the Dadaists were doing. What seems nonsensical is actually, seems like it's a way to unleash a psychic connection to whatever distress you're going through. Think of Francis Picabia, if you're familiar with him, and he was exploring, Cubism and Dadaism, and giving it a visual kind of language. They were still beautiful paintings. You have to listen in a new way, not looking for musical perfection, but hearing sounds with the equanimity of an artist who absorbs everything that comes into view. And maybe the Dadaists were doing that same kind of thing. Yes.
I think Mark makes a really important point about Dada and its historical moment. I think the people, artists at that time, were trying to express their horror created by the war. And so it was, a lot of it was really nihilistic art, and yet if we look at it today, we can say, well, they were still creating art. So that is, they didn't just commit suicide or whatever,
Yeah.
you know, they were still creating. I think Duchamp is maybe different because, I mean, I don't know that much about Dada, but looking at Duchamp, his art was playful, and so that seems to me to be a little bit different aesthetic there. And one of the things you brought up was an interaction between the painting, let's say, or the urinal as an object, and then the person who is viewing it.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, because there's this subject, you know, the person viewing, and then this object, the object is never just one thing, you know, it's the way we interact with something that maybe is static, just as you were saying about paintings, and yet they aren't really static because people are viewing them and people's thoughts about them always change. So
I think Cage resurrected Dadaism, which was actually a fairly short movement, short-lived movement. Mm-hmm. Resurrected it for his own purposes. And then encountering someone like Schoenberg, who uses dissonance, you know, his music is hard to hear, hard to listen to, but there's a beauty to it. So it's, you know, and I think of artists that I know now, one of the things that some of them endeavor to do is to really challenge people, mm-hmm. Challenge their philosophies within a space, or challenge with whatever a thing is or what reality is, because mm-hmm. reality, as we engage the things of our world, that's the manifest of it. So.
Right. Well, having studied music history a lot, there's something that musicians call the common practice period. And that basically means tonal music. So you could think of Bach and Mozart, Brahms, Beethoven, continuing on to Wagner and Mahler, let's say. There's a lot of variety in that older music. Let's start with Bach and then go on into the Romantic period and so on. There's a lot of variety there, but I think musicians, composers felt it's a tradition that we're changing somewhat, but we're still within that tradition. We know, for example, that these later composers studied the music of Bach and, you know, earlier people. And yet I think after the World Wars, then all kinds of artists, writers, painters, composers, dancers, they were all asking, how do we go on? Mm-hmm. The old order doesn't seem appropriate.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Dada is one reaction. What Schoenberg did was really radical.
Yeah. Well,
not
thanks
radical.
Stravinsky, thanks
Yeah,
Stravinsky
sure.
and Rite of Spring. And
Sure. So, anyway, I think they all came up with different
different,
solutions.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess when I go to a gallery, I'm at first, go to the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit, the beautiful pictures, the beautifully painted, and then I find myself sort of ready for the more difficult fare, or coming into the realm of a piece of art that is purposefully asking you to be uncomfortable with it so that you're asking questions, which is what I see Cage doing, and kind of, I don't know if he was at the beginning of it, but he was certainly coming at it a certain way.
Mhm.
So this, of course, is all working in the direction, I think, it almost feels like the culmination of the famous piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And of course, I'm drawing the connection between our practice, the arts, how much John Cage, I think, impersonates? Yes, becomes personally it for me, embodies it, personally embodies it. So.
Well, certainly there's an inclusiveness there. You think about that piece, which I hope you'll talk about next time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's kind of inclusive. There's a kind of acceptance there, which is of noises, as you were talking about before,
Yeah.
which I think you could relate to practice.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Anybody else? Time for tea?
A chant.
A chant.